together the fact that we put so much investment into data and sharing and all of your time and so many people in the community about this is exactly what we want at a university. So this is really good. I really thought when I came up with the title for this that I was being very clever, and I told Braden, who literally pulled out a presentation with the exact same title, and then I proceeded to find, I think there's even a third one in this year's series that has literally the same idea. So uh, I guess I have to move from thinking that I'm clever and special that maybe, great minds think alike. I'll try to leave it at that. So this is sort of what we're going to do here. I will say that this is based on a long period of having to learn things the hard way. So my hope today is one, if I can help anyone avoid that, but two, I'd like us to think practically at the university about what our data is and how do we genuinely use it to guide the decisions we make. So I've added a piece onto what I did from last year into this year to really get us thinking about student success. So let's first start with moderators. So this is really, in a way, sort of moving from the idea that some things are simple. And in my field, I think we always sort of start with this hope that, there's going to be this very powerful, simple relationship from your independent variable, your predictor, to your dependent variable, your outcome variable. But I'm a big Slipknot fan. Most people don't know that. And there's a song they have called Duality. And I always try to think about when we think about our data, the data have many complex stories with them. And often we only find them when our overly simplistic ideas are not good enough to explain our data. So that's where a moderator will come in. So the example that I've found to be most useful from my research is trying to understand adolescent well-being. So what are the things that lead to an adolescent feeling good about themselves, the world around them? And so if you think about that as your dependent variable, and you think about two possible independent variables. First, you have the idea of when adolescents hit puberty. So that'll be the first independent variable. And it turns out that if you look at puberty timing, so either you have early puberty or you have late puberty, it tells you literally nothing about well-being. So this is a case where if you look at the y-axis with our well-being there, you see that you have the same level of well-being whether you've hit puberty early or you've hit puberty late. So now, in a totally different direction, so we're looking at our independent variables and their relationship to the DVs separately, so we're not looking at the IVs together. You might then ask, well, does gender have anything to do with well-being? Independent, so forget for a second about puberty. And what you find here is generally boys have about the same level of well-being of girls. So you can think of both of these variables and how they might relate to well-being. And if you think of them independently, you really don't find much. However, when you think about your independent variables, and this took me a long time to get. So a moderator is simply just one of your two independent variables, and you choose which one is the moderator. You choose it in terms of what is your theory. And I won't say a lot about that today, but everything that I'll talk about today is based in the idea that there is a theoretical perspective, that there is a reason that we're not just throwing variables in to see what happens. Unfortunately, that still happens quite a bit. And sometimes you find things and it takes you off and you can publish papers, but your your long-term contribution tends to be less, I think, than if you have a good theory and you are being disciplined. So you can think about, I have one independent variable. In this case, I'll put puberty timing and as it relates to well-being. And then the second independent variable is important insofar as it tells you something unique about the relationship of A to B. So understanding gender helps you better understand the relationship of A to B. And so in this case, you find this is one of the more sort of striking cases of finding nothing independently, but together, what you find is that for early puberty, so we got that on our x-axis, boys, if they hit puberty early, tend to do much better in their well-being than boys who hit puberty late. Girls, on the other hand, now, of course, this isn't in every case, but generally, girls, on the other hand, if they hit puberty early, tend to do much worse in their well-being than girls who hit puberty late. Now, there are a lot of possible reasons as to why this might be happening. You could have more than one moderator. So there could be three independent variables that might help you understand aspects of it better. But that is sort of one perspective of how you might think about things. In a second, we're going to move to mediators and talk about not further understanding where the impact is, but why. But we're going to put why aside for a second. Right now, essentially, your gender tells you where the relationship between early and late puberty and well-being happens. And so it happens differently for the boys and for the girls. And so this is what I like to call the crisscross moderator. Of course, that's not the actual name. And there's also the other type of moderator where you don't have this crossing, but you end up with everything is sort of the same. It doesn't matter except one particular part of the moderator. And so I just want you to keep in mind there are many ways in which moderators can happen. Oftentimes, this is a more elegant moderator. The other one, I mean, it's so striking and that's great, but it also sometimes feels like it has a novelty feel to it. Whereas this is saying for one variable, the second variable doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything. But for the other side of it, the second variable changes things dramatically. And so that's where, particularly if there is a group, if this is a variable of vulnerability, this could help you think, okay, if we have limited resources and we can only intervene in certain places, it tells us of our four groups, there's one particular that's vulnerable. Or in another way, if this is a positive variable, maybe a little less useful, but it might tell us this is the group for whom we don't need to intervene. Or in some cases, if we did, it actually might make things worse. So that's something to think about. So I got this as either the Sesame Street moderator. So one of these things is not like the other. I also think it looks like a shark. So we can call this our baby shark moderator, whatever you prefer. And so the last thing I want to mention about moderators, and I think this can also be confusing, is that when you have two main effects, when essentially both variables are impacting something, that's not a moderator. The moderator is not, so you can run an analysis and both of your independent variables can separately contribute to an outcome. But if one doesn't tell you about the relationship of the other to the outcome, then they are not moderators. So it's not to say that the only time you can have something useful is when you have a moderator. In fact, sometimes if you have two independent variables, that may tell you much more because it means both things are worth knowing and that they are not either overlapping or intersecting in any meaningful way. So think of this as you go your own way, each have their own impact, just a very different way. Okay, so when we think about the moderators, things that I've talked about here is that it is always, you can only talk about a moderator insofar as you're also talking about an A to B relationship. So if you ever find yourself saying X variable moderates an outcome, you've left something out here. So it's not just that you have two independent variables, but they are functioning differently theoretically in what you were trying to accomplish. Now, it is also true that you can flip that over and you can talk about it in the other direction. And part of that is the storytelling part of data. Neither is inaccurate, but they are different ways. And you think about what is telling the most compelling story and what is the one that makes sense within a theoretical perspective. So other sort of key things about this, and I sort of mentioned the other pieces of the basics. This almost always involves cross-sectional data. It doesn't have to, but unlike mediators, it functions very well if you just have a snapshot in time. And I mentioned the other piece about if there is a moderator, you have to choose which is the AB and then which is the moderator. You could look at it both ways, but typically if you've started with the theory, only one of them makes sense. So now if we move over to our mediators. So let's go back to our idea of well-being. How are we going to support someone's well-being? Well, we can develop a treatment. We can think about what is a therapeutic. I'm a psychologist, so for me, it would be a behavioral therapy that might help with well-being. So if we think about our mediator, then the important question here is, how did this happen? So what are we trying to accomplish here is we're, in a way, trying to avoid finding something without having some due diligence about understanding why it's happening. And many of throughout history of science where we have seen damaging findings, things that we've later come to see were truly disrespectful, racist, gender insensitive. They often come from an A to B relationship without any effort to explain why they happen. The other place where it comes from, so if you look at therapy research, unfortunately, one of the best predictors of a therapy working is that someone who developed that therapy is one of the authors. Now, it's not saying that people are doing anything nefarious or that they shouldn't do, but just simply saying whether something works or not doesn't help us understand why it worked. And if we don't know why it worked, we are very at risk for accepting a finding that is maybe just a type 1 error where we've just, if we were to try to replicate it, we'd never be able to replicate it. So we want to think about if A to B, to what extent does the C variable, so now it's not just another sort of equal independent variable, but it is a third variable that we can actually look at the change in that variable. And that change is impacted or driven by the A variable. So whereas we tend to think of, well, did the treatment work? The first question we're going to ask instead is, did the treatment impact this other, in the case of my work, psychological variable? And once we know that, did that change? and what it tells you about the outcome, does that actually become the important thing and not the A variable anymore? Now, there's questions about whether the A to B relationship needs to go away once you know C. I won't get into all the details of that, but it is basically the idea that being in this therapy has changed you in some way. And it is that change that is leading to the improved well-being. So if you were to get the therapy and you didn't change in this way, your well-being, even though you got the therapy, wouldn't have improved. So that's where a mediator comes in. So you could think of a variable like self-esteem. Is this a therapy that improves the adolescent self-esteem? And is it the self-esteem that drives well-being? Now, what that would mean is it should be the case that if you could impact self-esteem without the therapy, you should be able to have the exact same impact. Now, the trick is the whole purpose of the therapy is to try to have that impact. So it would be hard to know how to do it, but at least hypothetically, that should be possible. So if we think about sort of the basics here, we need to see that the the change in the mediator has to be caused by A. So the A to C, and then that C to B has to be, and then the extent that's the full or the partial is some of the other stuff that I talked about before. So if we think of our three rules here, they have to be based on repeated measures. You cannot call it a mediator if it is one time point, because in one time point, if you've measured the whether you have the therapy or not, and if you measure the C variable, you can't know what's changed in C if you don't actually have two time points of C. And ideally, you really need to have a time point of C at the start of the therapy. Now, if you had it even before, that's even better. But at the start of the therapy, and then at a period before you were measuring your outcome. So you really need to have three measurements to be able to do this, which is why I think you are just much less likely to see really good, solid mediator work because a lot of our studies are not designed that way, or where we have repeated measures data, we don't have the data to link those repeated measures. I mean, it adds an enormous amount of cost. There's much more responsibility with IRBs to be able to not just have measurements on people at different times, but to be able to track whose measurements were who at those different times. So even that's a real issue. So, the thing I will say is these are changing all the time, but I will tell you that literature is filled with cross-sectional studies that do this. And of course, unfortunately, the literature is filled with some of my studies that do this. So this was early in my career. Well, it wasn't that early, actually. It was 13 years into my career. But still, like, you're learning things. You would think, over time I got better. Um, Actually, you can see that it wasn't just one time. I did it all the way back in 2008. So this is sort of a long-term thing that I had been doing. And I literally talked about cross-sectional and mediator all in the same sentence. And so I blame me a little bit, but I actually blame the journals that accepted these papers, and we just have to have higher standards in how we're doing this. So the last part I want to talk about is how do we think about this in measuring student success? So for this specifically, I'm interested in something I've been thinking a lot about now, or I want to talk to you about something I've been thinking a lot about. And that is, how do we increase both our retention and graduation rates so we can think of those as progression? And how do we increase the quality of learning? the extent to which students are getting more out of the classes that they have. And as you know, the university has a pretty extensive, led by the same folks who are sponsoring this event, to get us to do everything we can to make sure that we're not just looking at, listen, whether someone completes college or whether they stay the first to second year, they're important, but they're not as important as to whether students have become better people, whether they've learned the things that was the hope within a class. So if we think about for a second, what is going to tell us about these variables? And so when you look in the literature, there's a lot of literature about gaps between students who are low income and students who have more financial means. So you might think of Pell status as a potential independent variable as it relates to these things. So the student's ability to learn the material in the way it was meant to be learned, a student's progression through the university, being able to do well in their classes. Now, Stony Brook's an interesting place because we're of the top 50 publics, we're one of, I think, only three where our Pell eligible students actually score better in these areas than the rest of our campus. But it still is an important variable that brings a vulnerability potentially that we want to be aware of. So we can look at that. At Stony Brook, it's a little bit different. But then there's living on campus in year one. That's another variable. Now, we know from other data that living on campus in year one is predictive of each of these outcomes, particularly the retention and graduation rates. So if we are thinking about what's the best strategy to support students in that, we want to have them live on campus. What I will say is that at Stony Brook, we don't do that. And so we have about 75% of our students live on campus in their first year. Part of the reason for that ties back to the Pell status. We also have, I think we're one of only three schools in the top 50 that have over 40% of our students are Pell eligible. Now, you might ask about, well, what's the cost of coming to the university? We are in the bottom quartile of the top 50 in tuition, which means we have a very low tuition. And we're in the top quartile in our cost of housing and dining. So when you think about the full cost of attendance, we're actually not as good of a bargain as we sometimes say we are. And particularly that real cost where students are often not getting support is in the housing. Now, that's not anyone's fault. It's just incredibly expensive to do housing here. So now there's a question of, well, what's the right thing to do? We might want to say, based on what I said before, that we want to encourage students to live on campus. Maybe we require it. At the same time, I think the reason we haven't is this idea that many of our students may not be able to afford it. It's hard to know what the right answer is there. Then you can think about the distance from campus. Now, that's a tricky one because those living on campus will all be a zero. The other 25% will be a number between 0 and however many miles they're living when they're not on campus. So that's not ideal, but it probably brings us something that's worth thinking about. Does it matter? Maybe living on campus only matters if otherwise you would live really far away. Maybe living 2 miles away isn't an issue. Now, if there's something happening about living on campus, the distance actually shouldn't have any impact. Living far, living close, you might be equally vulnerable. But if there's something about it's not living on campus, it's the drive to campus, then that distance could potentially be the moderator of that relationship. We can also think about readiness for college. Maybe it is in the sort of shark moderator. Maybe it's a case that it only matters for students who aren't as ready for college. Maybe living on campus, we need to require it, but maybe not for students who come in with a certain GPA. Now, that starts to sound not very equitable. So, all of these things, if you were to think about them, you could put any of them as an independent variable. You could have almost any of them as a moderator. And in some cases, you'd want to have multiple of those because at some point, we've got to figure out what's our strategy as a university. We can guess, but if we can use these data to actually help us understand what is the actual vulnerability? Is it the long drive? Is it the missing out on experiences? Is it the cost? We have no idea. And this is a case of where using the right data approach can actually help us do that. Now, the mediator means we should be measuring this at the start of the year. What are the impacts of living on campus? What are the impacts of the long drive? Does it create sort of an exhaustedness that is what's actually driving it? Does it living on campus create a sense of involvement or inclusion? And that's what's driving it. So we actually have everything we need to be able to answer an important question like, should we require students to live on campus or not? If we can look at the moderators, think about what are the processes that those things would create, and then identify what's the right intervention to have the impact. So with that, I think my conclusions are all things that I said. If you're interested in talking about this more, I would be very happy to have you reach out to me. And again, I can't say enough how much I appreciate that we have this event.
Thank you. We have about 2 minutes. Are there any questions?
I wanted to go back to the crisscross diagram. How would a layperson, in terms of well-being, support the boy going through late puberty and the girl going through early puberty?
Yeah, so the first step is even knowing where those things are. And so that at least gives you a sense of, but what it doesn't tell you is why. And so I think the first thing we'd have to do is develop some other studies to understand what psychological process is happening for girls early on. I think oftentimes people believe a girl who is developing earlier may get herself into what, I want to say this the right way. Others may be more predatory in creating discomfort for that individual, whereas for a boy, they may not have the same physical stature that would help. And so I think part of it might be understanding that can be the case and trying to think about what would be, even on a case by case basis, what would be the ways in which you could support either in the way a classroom is structured or how you set up protective factors. But it might just also be helping to explain this is something that is relevant now, but maybe won't be once that initial impact happens. Maybe I'll take one more.
Yeah, any other questions?
I have a quick question. So, I know in the field of psychology, usually quantitative studies, it's more, what researchers more leaning towards. So I was just wondering, as you were talking, even to answer Diana's question, so when you're trying to get that qualitative data, I guess how qualitative research can complement um, the quantitative studies. And do, have you tried some of the qualitative methods? What were the results?
Yeah, no, that's great. And actually, I mean, I think the a question is really how can you then take what you're finding qualitatively and have some measure of it? So the first part of the qualitative is it's going to get you much richer data. Where it gets tricky getting it into these sort of analyses is then how do you distill it into single variables where you still haven't lost the richness of it? I think in a lot of cases, folks feel like they can't, and so they tend to stay apart. But I've always felt like it's better. I'd rather have a boiled down qualitative variable than a really highly precise quantitative one that actually has nothing to do with the real world. So it requires, I think, a little bit of give and take to put them together. If you're willing to do it, I think you can get at things that particularly will help with the mediators.
Mixed methods are hard to design sometimes, even though some people, loosely use the term, quantitative study in the definition of mixed research. But to design a good one, it's very tough. Thank you
And you
for your
really
answer.
need experts on both sides. I
Yes,
think a lot of times you have
yes.
someone who does one and says they're doing the other, but they're not really doing it right. So I think it's a good point. All right.
Right.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. Hope to see you all in our next sessions. Bye.